Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, family members and friends. I'm Second Lieutenant Keely Ingalls, Wofford graduate of 2020 and Commissioned Army Officer of the Southern Guards Battalion. Welcome to our 2020 Veterans Day ceremony. We are gathered here to honor all veterans and also remember our fellow alumni who, as Abraham Lincoln said, gave the last full measure of devotion. Ladies and gentlemen, the Southern Guards Battalion Professor of Military Science, Lieutenant Colonel Brian Dunker.
Families and friends of the Southern Guards Battalion, thank you for joining us today as we gather on the 11th hour on the 11th day of the 11th month of the year. It is my privilege to be here to honor all veterans and salute a very special group of people, Wofford's alumni who have sacrificed everything to defend this great nation. President Calvin Coolidge said long ago, "The nation which forgets its defenders will itself be forgotten." We haven't forgotten, and we never will. This is the solemn promise of Wofford College, the Southern Guards, ROTC Battalion, and a grateful nation. In honor of all soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines, let us live a life that pays tribute to their daily sacrifices in protecting the free world. To our Wofford alumni who have made the ultimate sacrifice, we are forever grateful. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. God bless our veterans. God bless the Southern Guards Battalion, and God bless America. Conquer and prevail.
Today we are honoring the 102 Wofford alumni who fought and died for our country, spanning from the Great War to the current conflicts known as the Global War on Terror. To remember and to honor each one properly, we will recall their names, class, branch of service, and rank. Before we begin, let us pause for a moment of silence. Thank you.
Frank L. Chenault, Class of 1917, United States Army, Sergeant First Class. Earl A. Davidson, Class of 1914, United States Army, Private. Robert T. Fletcher, Class of 1916, United States Army, Private. Charles D. Graham, Class of 1916, United States Marine Corps, Corporal. Thomas C. Herbert, Class of 1914, United States Army, First Lieutenant. William A. Hudgens, Class of 1897, United States Army, First Lieutenant. Thomas D. Lake, Jr., Class of 1914, United States Army, First Lieutenant. Clarence A. Lewis, Class of 1916, United States Army, First Lieutenant. Ernest F. McWhorter, Class of 1904, United States Army, Private. John T. Moore, Class of 1913, United States Navy, Yeoman, Second Class. Frank G. Montgomery, Class of 1914, United States Army, First Lieutenant. William N. Nichols, Class of 1911, Royal Artillery, Second Lieutenant. Melvin C. Rogers, Class of 1915, United States Army, Private. Hubert M. Smith, Class of 1915, United States Army, First Lieutenant. Thomas R. Summers, Class of 1917, United States Army, Sergeant. John M. Thomas, Class of 1920, South Carolina National Guard, Private. J. M. Lanham, Jr., Class of 1915, United States Army, Private. Lafayette B. Adams, Class of 1945, United States Army, First Lieutenant. William H. Alexander, Class of 1945, United States Army, Sergeant. David B. Anderson, Jr., Class of 1937, Army Air Corps, First Lieutenant. Everett L. Bass, Class of 1941, Army Air Corps, Sergeant. Roy V. Bishop, Class of 1940, Army Air Corps, Staff Sergeant. Evander C. Bryant, Class of 1937, United States Army, First Lieutenant. Ralph S. Bryant, Class of 1937, United States Army, Captain. William P. Berman, Jr., Class of 1940, United States Army, Captain.
Boney B. Byers, Class of 1941, Army Air Corps, Technical Sergeant. Charles B. Church, Class of 1932, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. Wendell E. Cole, Class of 1946, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. John F. Compton, Class of 1942, U.S. Army, Second Lieutenant. Sheldon M. Danley, Class of 1939, U.S. Army, Captain. William T. Dixon, Jr., Class of 1946, U.S. Army, Captain. Ben R. Easterling, Class of 1939, U.S. Army, Sergeant. Henry P. Ellis, Class of 1941, Army Air Corps, First Lieutenant. James A. Faust, Class of 1943, U.S. Army, Second Lieutenant. John D. Ferguson, Class of 1945, U.S. Army, Private First Class. Thomas O. Fowler, Class of 1942, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. John H. Franks, Class of 1944, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. Earl P. Furman, Jr., Class of 1944, U.S. Army, Army Air Corps, Specialist. Claude E. Gatlin, Jr., Class of 1945, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. Irwin P. Gibbons, Class of 1941, U.S. Army, Specialist. Fred E. Glipsey, Class of 1942, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. William H. Gladden, Jr., Class of 1939, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. Homer L. Glenn, Class of 1940, U.S. Army, Second Lieutenant. Horace E. Gravely, Class of 1927, U.S. Army, Private. Walter K. Hale, Jr., Class of 1943, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. Lyles B. Hardin, Class of 1935. Walter B. Hayes, Class of 1938, Army Air Corps, Corporal. James B. Hines, Jr., Class of 1938, U.S. Army Armor, Captain. George A. Henley, Class of 1945, U.S. Army, Second Lieutenant. Ernest G. Hewitt, Jr., Class of 1946, U.S. Army, Private.
Carly M. Hinson, Class of 1933, U.S. Army, Private First Class. Brian F. Hodges, Class of 1938, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. Frank C. Hodges, Class of 1929, U.S. Army, Captain. William E. Johnson, Jr., Class of 1939, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. Julian K. Joliffe, Class of 1943, United States Navy, Ensign. Drew L. King, Class of 1926, U.S. Army, Second Lieutenant. Warden H. King, Jr., Class of 1943, U.S. Army Air Corps, First Lieutenant. Wilson K. King, Class of 1942, U.S. Army, Second Lieutenant. James M. Lee, Class of 1938, U.S. Army, Captain. Eugene E. Little, Class of 1940, U.S. Army, Captain. John J. Little, Class of 1935, U.S. Army, Captain. William M. McLeod, Class of 1921, U.S. Army, Captain. John H. Marlowe, Class of 1945, U.S. Army, Sergeant. Theodore P. Mason, Class of 1936, U.S. Army, Major. James H. Morris, Class of 1947, U.S. Army, Private. James O. Mosley, Class of 1945, U.S. Army, Sergeant. Fred M. Nanny, class of 1942, U.S. Army Air Corps, Cadet. Francis D. Noonan, class of 1942, U.S. Army, Captain. Michael D. Oakman, class of 1946, U.S. Army, Private. Edward W. Owens, class of 1942, U.S. Army, First Lieutenant. Maxwell F. Perot, class of 1938, U.S. Army, Captain. Norman D. Priester, Jr., class of 1941, U.S. Army, Second Lieutenant. John E. Raffney, Jr., class of 1945, U.S. Army, Private. Thomas C. Reed, Jr., class of 1936, United States Navy, Ensign. William W. Ritter, class of 1937, United States Army, Second Lieutenant.
Roy Robertson, class of 1935, Army Air Corps, Second Lieutenant. Eddie Robinson, class of 1943, United States Army, Second Lieutenant. Simon K. Rowland, Jr., class of 1941, United States Army, Second Lieutenant. James Shands, class of 1940, United States Army, First Lieutenant. James O. Smith, class of 1944, United States Marine Corps, Private First Class. John W. Speak, class of 1931, Army Air Corps, Captain. Gordon S. Stevens, class of 1939, United States Army, Captain. Roach S. Stewart, Jr., class of 1941, United States Army, First Lieutenant. Leonard T. Thompson, class of 1936, United States Army, Sergeant. William F. Thompson, class of 1946, United States Army, Private First Class. David A. Wallace, class of 1925, United States Army, First Lieutenant. Lawrence F. Watson, Jr., class of 1945, Army Air Corps, Second Lieutenant. Richard R. Watts, class of 1940, United States Army, First Lieutenant. Guy W. Wilkes, Jr., class of 1942, United States Army, First Lieutenant. Alan O. Wood, class of 1940, United States Army, First Lieutenant. Norman E. Bowen, class of 1949, United States Air Force, First Lieutenant. Robert E. Haynes, class of 1937, United States Army, Major. Avery W. Williamson, class of 1934, United States Army, Major. Frank H. Burwell, class of 1939, United States Army, Captain. Leyburn W. Brockwell, Jr., class of 1951, United States Army, Lieutenant Colonel. Audley M. Federline, Sr., class of 1959, United States Army, Captain. Furman W. Massengale, class of 1970, United States Army, First Lieutenant. John S. Reeves, Jr., class of 1968, United States Army, Sergeant. Harold S. Sale, Jr., class of 1964, United States Air Force, Captain. Ted J. Taylor, class of 1968, United States Army, Captain. Andrew J. Shields, class of 2001, United States Army, First Lieutenant. John M. Bunn, class of 1986, United States Army, Captain.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today as we remember how great the cost for a nation to be free. Once again, President Lincoln reminded us, it is for us, the living, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who fought have thus so far nobly advanced. Let us continue their work and honor their sacrifice. This concludes the ceremony. Thank you.